What's going on, guys? Car coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we'll be diving into some historic meta, kind of discussing what decks are currently trending in the best of one meta overall. Yet again, if you haven't seen one of my lists here of meta decks, we kind of go look at Aether Hub. We kind of give a ranking of the decks that are being most played to the least played. Usually go about the top 5. In today's video, we're gonna be going over those top 5 best of one decks currently in the meta, starting at the bottom, working our way at the top. It doesn't mean that the deck at the top is always the better deck, but it does kind of fluctuate where the majority of players are playing, to kind of give you an idea whether you may be playing one of these decks. Or at the same time too, if you're playing a different deck that aren't these decks, these are decks that you definitely can run into, as one would guess, just based on if you played overall historic meta. You can probably pretty much guess at least one deck as being a deck that would definitely make this list. I'm not going to say it now, but you know, we'll eventually get there. If you want to leave a comment now guessing what deck that is, go for it. And at the end of the video, I'm going to give you like one bonus deck that I think is very budget friendly if you're a newer player to maybe the meta side, the historic meta side of MTG Arena. But with enough being said, guys, if you like this video, hit that like button. If you want to post more videos, hit that subscribe button, and let's move on to the decks. Alright, so the first deck up, if you haven't seen this deck, is a deck that I feel that in standard you are probably annoyed with this color scheme and the cards that are in it, and that is the Rakdos Sacrifice deck. So in this deck, if you don't know what this deck does already, the goal here is to sacrifice a whole bunch of things, deal a whole bunch of damage to your opponent, and annoy the crap out of your opponent, just because I feel like the way this deck plays, not saying I'm not criticizing anybody who plays this deck, but the way this deck plays, it kind of is a very slow, very grindy deck, in the sense that it's doing things to kind of just slowly dwindle down your opponent's creatures and also their life total. So to start off the deck, it is running Giganta as the overall commander or companion of the deck, just because you know, it's just a big solid 5/5, as well as it can be used to produce a whole bunch of mana, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of everything, and it can only be spent to play generic mana cost. So I mean, just a way to just play a big body that's a 5/5, as well as allowing you to get, you know, get some additional mana, which is always good, especially with it being dual mana. And there's things in the deck that cost a colorless plus a whatever color, so you can definitely play this to help pump things out. But really, that's not we can eliminate this, because if you don't have this, you don't have to have it in the deck. It just is one of those things to help. But what it boils down to is that it's playing the Cauldron familiar, it's the cat sacrifice, you know, throw it in the oven, bring it back on the battlefield, that whole spiel to kind of, you know, gain a life, make your opponent lose a life without really having to do too much, and allows us to kind of turn on some other things that, you know, use for sacrifice fodder. So there is that. Next card up is the Gutter Bones. Another thing that is, whenever, you know, you get dealt damage to your opponent, if this thing ends up in the graveyard, you're allowed to, your opponent lost life this turn, I should say, you're allowed to tap 2, return it back to our hand, and then you can play it again. So it's another way to recycle. So a lot of the things in this deck, as you notice, will also recycle over and over again, just allowing you to just replay things over and over again, to just in case if your opponent spot removals it, or if you just want to kind of gain some momentum and just kind of sacrifice it to the Priest of the Forgotten Gods. A lot of this stuff is really just fodder, so that is the thing. Next card up is Rakdos Scorpion, another thing that's just very strong, in the sense it's a 1 mana 1/2, and the idea that it deals 2 damage to each opponent and you gain 2 life, a way to kind of gain some life back as you kind of are grinding throughout the game. Follow that up with the Village Rite. It's a good solid instant speed spell that allows you to sacrifice a creature and you get to draw 2 cards. The next card up is kind of going to be one of the other ways to help with this, and it just getting 2 cards for 1 mana, and the only thing is you have to sacrifice a creature is very good. Combine that with Claim the Firstborn. This allows you to now take one of your opponent's creatures that's a converted mana cost 3 or less, untap that creature, you can swing back into that creature, swing with that creature back at that opponent if their board's not very established, and now sacrifice it to the Village Race, now taking that gaining card advantage, or even using their own creature for a Priest of the Forgotten Gods fodder, and you know, activating that ability. So just another very solid little combo there. Then of course the Witch's Oven, yet again another way to sacrifice maybe your opponent's creatures that you claimed, and the ability to kind of turn on the Cat Oven style of the deck. So that is another thing. So I don't really want to go into more things, but it really just turns on the Cat Oven, and you get a food token. So if you ever are low on life, you can always sacrifice food, eat it. The Blood Artist is kind of one of these intriguing things that came in with Jumpstart. Whenever it or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this actually means all creatures. So if your opponent's creatures die, they also lose a life and you gain a life. So that's actually very good, and that actually mills your opponent down just that much faster, much more faster, I should say. But it's a very interesting thing, and it only costs 2 mana, so it's, I think, like, in a weird way, as much as you play Mayhem Devil, if you don't have any copies of these, or if you're very limited on wild cards, it's kind of like a thing that you gain some more life for sacrificing things on the, or having things die on the battlefield overall. Combine this with Cauldron Familiar, and now you're making your opponent lose 2 life and you gain 2 life a turn, so that's definitely a very, very good combination as well. Then of course the Priest of Forgotten Gods, the ability to sacrifice 2 other creatures, any number of target players that each lose 2 life, you sacrifice a creature, and then you add 2 mana and draw a card. So just another way to turn on the engine, play a few more things in your hand, just kind of, you know, dwindle down what your opponent is doing. It's just, you know, this deck is just in that sense very grindy. Then follow up with Dreadhorde Butcher. It's a solid 2 mana 1/1 haste. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, it gets +1/+1 counter, and whenever it dies, it deals damage equal to that its power to any target. Combine that with the multiple ways of sacrificing things in the late game. You know, this thing, if it gets to a 3/3 or 4/4 and your opponent's starting to sit at low life total, you can easily just sacrifice it and burn your opponent directly in the face. Combine that also with something like Call of the Death Dweller. You can always bring back a Dreadhorde Butcher with a Call of the Death Dweller. You can always sacrifice it if it has Death Touch, throw it into something that's larger that's in your way from hitting your opponent in the face, even for the 1 point of damage. It's another way to kind of, you know, turn that ability on. So definitely a very interesting kind of play there. Then throw that with the Woe Strider, another very solid card for the deck, another way to sacrifice things that you may steal with Claim the Firstborn to allow you to scry the top card of your library, another way to add a sacrifice ability onto the battlefield. So if you have any of your Blood Artist or your Mayhem Devils, it's just another way to turn on you, allowing yourself to be able to do damage to your opponent by killing creatures, essentially allowing them to hit your opponent in the face. So and the other thing too is this, if this dies and goes to the graveyard, you can always later in the game for 5 mana always exile 4 other cards from our graveyard and put 2+1/+1 counters on it, and it comes back on the battlefield, and then allowing you to just kind of turn it back on. So even if it doesn't stay on the battlefield for too long, it can always come back later and, you know, definitely, you know, hurt your opponent even more. Then throw it up, like I said, the Mayhem Devil. It's a very solid 3/3 for 3 mana, and whenever your player sacrifices a permanent, any permanent, so if your opponent's playing like Fabled Passages or things to sacrifice to look for mana in their pool, they have their own food. This is going to allow you to now target 1 point of damage to any target as well. So a very solid card. Like I said, if you haven't seen this deck before, it's pretty much the same deck in Standard with a couple little spins that have addition, you know, they add a couple cards that are only in the historic meta, like things from Jumpstart and things like that. It's really just an add-on of what you may have already seen. So like I said, you may have seen some of these cards and may have already know how this deck works, but just kind of give me like a quick little rundown of exactly how this works. Then followed up with the Cathal Lockthwain for mana, 2 mana. Then we get the Phyrexian Tower, which is another mana that's actually from Jumpstart that actually you can sacrifice a creature and you can add 2 mana. So you can sacrifice a creature, a token, you know, whatever creature, and now you get 2 additional mana to play something, which is very solid, instead of, you know, the 1 colorless. It's a legendary land, so that's only why it's a 1-of copy, but definitely something you maybe think about if you have an extra copy, maybe you have 2 of, but definitely something that's good for the deck that you definitely don't see in the Standard meta. And then followed up with 5 Swamps, 3 Mountains, 4 Blood Crypts, Dragon Skull Summit, which is comes into battlefield tapped unless we control a swamp or mountain card, but definitely very solid mana choice. And then 4 Fabled Passages, which yet again is a good card to sacrifice for like a Mayhem Devil to then get a trigger. So definitely a good little additional way to ping some damage. But overall, this deck is pretty solid. You know, it doesn't really require, if this is something that you may have already played in Standard, doesn't require too many more like cards that are from Jumpstart to really make it work. You can pretty much probably play the Standard version you played like before like Cat got banned, and then kind of make a couple minor tweaks, maybe add some of the, you know, the Blood Artists, which are only uncommons, and then just work on getting a Phyrexian Tower, and then your deck is set. So overall, this deck is fun. It is the 5th like most played deck currently in the meta, so if you haven't seen it, this is something that you could run into. I think it's probably like 8 or 9% at the moment. So I mean, this is something that always fluctuates, so it's like 8 or 9 now. You know, for all we know, in the weekend more people will start playing, it goes up on the list, but it's definitely a deck that you will definitely see in the current historic meta. All right, so I mean, it wouldn't be a meta in a best of 1 format if there wasn't like a burn deck or mono red deck. I mean, unfortunately, this list does have 2 mono red decks, And this one is actually the mono red burn, I would say. The goal here of this deck is just kind of deal as much damage to your opponent's face by playing burn spells or creatures that, you know, deal additional damage based on, you know, based on whether you have instants or sorceries, or you can sack them to deal damage to the face. But overall, the goal of this deck is just to bring your opponent down as quickly as possible and hitting them quicker than they can kind of, you know, hit you. So overall, the deck plays a lot of things to just punish your opponent, especially if they're playing a slower deck. To start off, we got to get into the Lava Runner, as if there are 2 or more instant or sorcery cards in our graveyard, it gets +1/+0 and haste. So as much as maybe in the early game it's a 1 mana 1/2, if you played it on turn 3 or turn 4 and you've maybe played a shock or 2 in the game, or a couple of, like, you know, spells, it comes in the battlefield as a 2/2 for 1 mana and has haste, so you can attack it immediately. Then we have the Grim Lavamancer card from Jumpstart that we can tap 1 red mana, exile 2 cards now from our graveyard, and it deals 2 damage to any target. Doesn't sound super impressive, but in the late game when you start playing a lot of spells in your graveyard and you're starting to run a little dry in your hand and you don't have a lot of cards to play, you can always tap the 1 red mana a turn and just ping your opponent for 2, and that 2 damage is going to eventually add up. So definitely a good solid card. It's a 2 of, but you know, it's something that definitely in the late game could be good. 4 shocks, of course, because it's a 1 mana spell that deals 2 damage to any target. Then we get the so out of all the decks, this is actually, I think, the only deck on this list that actually has cards from Amonkhet, which I'm very surprised of, but we got the Soul Scar Mage from Amonkhet. You know what this guy does? He has Prowess, which, if you haven't played that, like, is it spells deck from Standard, Prowess is an ability that whenever we play a non-creature spell, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and then if a source we control would do non-combat damage to a creature an opponent controls, put that many +1/-1/1 counters on that creature instead. So essentially what this is, if you say shock a creature that's a 4/4, for example, like a Questing Beast that may come up in the historic meta, you instead of doing 2 damage, and then that damage would fizzle away if you didn't actually kill the creature, and now gets 2 -1/-1 counters, which essentially helps chomp down these bigger creatures that you may not be able to attack through. And then you swing in, and this thing now is a 2/3, and you can, you know, hit that 4/4, you know, swing over that 4/4 creature, and now they have to consider if they want to block or not. So definitely a very interesting card in that sense. I mean, other than that, the -1/-1 counters are okay. I mean, if the spell would kill the creature regardless, I mean, it's going to kill the creature regardless. But like I said, the ability to now chump down creatures a little bit to get them more manageable, like that turns a big creature into a small creature, is definitely a good idea. And the idea that this card is Prowess just helps that just that much more. Follow that up with a Lightning Strike. I don't know why I chose 1/1, but I guess that's how I own the copies. I don't really know, but it's a 2 mana 3 damage to any target, which is a very solid thing. You know, it's 3 damage to any target, instant speed, always good. Maybe with the Pyromancer, when it enters the battlefield, it does 2 damage to target player or planeswalker, so a good thing that comes to the battlefield. It immediately does 2 damage, and then it's a 2/1 for 2 mana, which is very solid. As you can see here, like I said, it's just a lot of things that just hit your opponent in the face or their, you know, their life total very, very quickly. Of course, it wouldn't be a mono red burn deck without this guy, Bone Crusher Giant. It's a, you know, it's got the 2 mana, 2 damage to any target. Can't be prevented, and then it's a, you know, the turnaround is that you can now have a 4/3 that whenever it gets targeted with a spell, their player who targets it with a spell now gets 2 damage, so it's hard to remove unless they have a global removal ability. And then on top of it, it's a mono red deck, so why not have Lay at the Stage? As long as your opponent takes damage, you can play it for its spectacle cost, which is 1 red mana, and then we get exile top 2 cards of our library until end of turn. We can maybe play those cards, so it just kind of extends our hand just that much more. And the idea of just drawing 2 cards for 1 mana is very strong, and then all it takes is us to do some damage to our opponent. So like I said, this deck is lined up to do damage to your opponent, so definitely easy to probably cast this on like a turn 1, turn 2, and just fill up your hand even more. Then we got the Rampage and Ferocidon, which is a 3 mana 3/3. It has Menace, so it takes 2 creatures in order to block it. But essentially now our opponent can't gain life, which is definitely good against like those mono white or Orzhov Lifegain style decks. So now our opponent can't gain life back when it, you know, from Lifegain or anything like that. And then whenever another creature enters the battlefield, it actually deals 1 damage to that creature's controller. So now if our opponent's already low, and we don't play a lot of creatures essentially, if our opponent's already low, every time now they play a creature to maybe stand in our way, they are going to start taking 1 point of damage, and yet again it's another thing that just kind of adds up over time. So, and they can't gain life, so essentially now they're slowly withering away their own life total to try to save themselves from being, you know, burned out. Then we have Skewer the Critters, which is another very solid spell that has Spectacle. It's a 3 mana 3 damage to any target, but if we've dealt damage, our opponent has lost life this turn, we now get to play for the 1 mana, though it's sorcery speed, so we can't, you know, ping them at the end of turn, and then also do another 1 damage instantly. So we have to kind of do this on our turn. You know, you usually attack in during your first attack step, and then on your second main you could just follow up and play this. Definitely a very solid card. The idea that it only costs 1 as long as they took damage is just definitely very, very good. Then yet again, we got Wizard's Lightning, and this costs 2 less if you control a wizard. I think there's a couple wizards in our deck. I think Lavamancer, for example, is a wizard. The Soul Sergeant Mage is a wizard. Pyromancer is a wizard. The only thing I don't think is a wizard is the Bone Crusher Giant. But Wizard's Lightning is a 3 mana, 3 damage to any target, but it costs 2 less, so this could be literally a 1 mana, 3 damage to any target. Yet again, a very strong card for a mono red deck in a burn style deck. So right to the face, you know, hopefully maybe finishing out your opponent or just catching them off guard and burn one of their creatures. Then another card from Amonkhet that made the deck is we have Hazoret the Fervent. It's a 4 mana 5/4, indestructible and haste. So you know your opponent can't destroy it with any like kill spell, but they can exile it. So that is something they can do. And it can't attack or block unless we have 1 or fewer cards in hand. But what we can do here is now we can remove any dead cards, or like maybe we don't need these extra lands we have. We start drawing a lot of lands. We now tap 3, discard a card, and now it deals 2 damage to each opponent. So now we're starting to wither away our opponent by tapping 3 mana, dealing 2 damage. Definitely a good card to actually whittle our hand down and then allow us to attack in with a 5/4. Definitely a very interesting card. This is definitely a late game finisher. I mean, if we're playing a lot of these burn spells earlier, you are definitely going to wither your opponent down quickly, and they're not going to be able to do anything to kind of counteract that. Then follow that up with 17 Mountains and 4 Ram-Unap Ruins, which is a new card from Amonkhet. Remastered, we can add a colorless, we can tap it, pay 1 life, add a red, or we can tap 4, sacrifice it, and deal 2 damage to each opponent. Yet again, another card to kind of like maybe finish the game off. Maybe you got the burn card to end the game following turn, who really knows. But definitely a good card to kind of have to just kind of close the game out, kind of just whittle your opponent down to that last little bit of life points that they would have. Overall, this is a fun deck. If you just don't get the right cards in certain matchups, it could be an issue. But overall, this deck is like, the goal here is just to hit your opponent as hard as possible, as quickly as possible. So I would say, this is a fun deck too if you like that mono red flavor, but don't want to play like the mono red like aggro aggressive. This is kind of more that classic mono red burn decks that maybe you've seen in past Magic. So definitely a fun deck to try out. Overall, this one is not too expensive. If you play a little bit of Standard, you may have some of these cards like the Bone Crusher Giants. The only thing is, like, as you can see here, there's some things that if you don't play Historic normally that you're gonna have to get. And with Jumpstart being gone, you'd have to get a couple Grim Lavamancers, and then you have to kind of buy into a little bit of Amonkhet and get some Horzorets and then some Rampraise and Ferocodons from can't think of the set name off the top of my head. But also from this set. So I mean, overall, it's not a very expensive deck, but it is a very fun deck when you do put it together. So as you saw with the mono red deck that we just did, next deck up is the mono white deck, the counteractive deck that kind of goes against that mono red deck burn deck that we got. Definitely a good deck for those more aggressive decks, because I mean, the thing here is that you're going to gain a lot of life to kind of counteract maybe the life you're losing in the process of maybe your opponent being very aggressive back at you. But overall, this is kind of like one of those classic mono white decks you may have seen already in Standard if you play in Standard, or maybe if you just play a lot of Historic. This is just kind of like a deck that you've seen. This deck has a lot of things that gain life or take benefits of you gaining life, and and it's on the more small side, so a lot of things are not as aggressive and big. So a lot of things are super cheap, but there's a lot of things that take benefit of you being at a higher life total. So the goal here is to probably get to at least 27, I think, is the minimum to make this deck effective. But if you can kind of get to like the higher range, like on that 35 to like 40, if not higher, you definitely are going to be probably guaranteed to win, unless you fizzle out or your opponent plays something like an Ugin, kind of wipes your board out, and then kind of have to rebuild. But overall, this deck is straightforward in what it's trying to do. It's just trying to gain a whole bunch of life, hopefully triggering a whole bunch of things that benefit from you gaining a bunch of life. There's not really too many things in here that are super crazy you may have not already seen in a mono white style deck. This one's a little interesting because it plays a couple of the cards that are from like M21 and stuff like that. So that's definitely cool. There's some things I haven't seen personally in a mono white deck, but overall it's a fun deck to play. It's on the cheaper side if you played mono white in Standard. So let's break it down. So first off, you have the Healer's Hawk, which is a very good bird. It's a 1 mana 1/1 with flying and lifelink. not many people play a lot of flying, so definitely something that's going to get in for that 1 point of damage and gaining that 1 life. And at the beginning, 1 life's not going to matter, but once you start getting into once you start building up your board with things that benefit from you gaining life, this 1 life is going to definitely turn into things that are going to help you overall build up a presence on the board. Then we got the Legion's Landing. Enters battlefield, we get a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. And when we attack with 3 or more creatures, we get to transform it. And then you'd be wondering to yourself, what does it transform into? What it transforms into is this card right behind me here. It's a legendary land as it kind of flickers by, because that's exactly what I wanted. Thank you, Magic. But what it does is now we can tap mana. There we go. Tap 3 mana. We can create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. So pretty much what this does is just allows us to create a fodder to add more creatures on the battlefield with lifelink, so things to gain more life. Then we get the Sarah's Ascendant. It's a 1/1 with lifelink. You may be like, it's not very good. But as long as we have 30 or more life, it gets +5/+5 and has flying. So you may not want to play this on the early game, but you may want to play this on turn 4, turn 5, where you maybe be closer to that 30 life. And this becomes bigger, and now it's a 6/6 lifelinker that has flying that your opponent now has to deal with. So definitely a cool card in that sense, and it only costs 1 mana. Soul Warden is a interesting card here. It's a 1 mana 1/1, but whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life. So the whole no matter who plays a creature, you're going to gain life benefits from that creature. So just an additional way to gain quicker life to get up to that higher life total. Then we got Speaker of the Heavens, which is a new card from M21. It's not newer, it's newer. I wouldn't say new, but it's a Vigilance lifelinker. It has the ability that we can tap it. We can create a 4/4 white angel token with flying. Activate this ability only if we have at least 7 life or more than your starting life total, and only anytime you cast sorcery. Now, you may be wondering why it says 7 life total or more. You can play like, the commander style, and you start at 25. That's the reason why they didn't put 20. That's because you already started a higher life total in different formats. So they kind of did that. But with a lot of lifelink that we have, we can definitely get to that 27 life total if our opponent's not super duper aggressive and burning down our life total. So definitely a good card in the sense that in the late game, if we're at a high life total, we're pumping out 4 4s that our opponent now has to deal with flying. They don't have lifelink, but 4 4s in the air, definitely something hard to deal with. And we got Shadow Spear here. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has trample and lifelink. A good way to give something that doesn't have lifelink, and the idea that it gives it trample is pretty awesome. And on top of that, which I haven't used too often, but in this rare circumstances, you can tap 1, permanents your opponent's control lose hexproof, and indestructible to end a turn. So if your opponent does something where they gives all their things hexproof and indestructible, which I think it's heroic. It's the green card from M21, Heroic Intervention or something like that. I think it's a 2 mana green card. I could get the name wrong, but that's something that you can actually tap 1 with this and actually remove all that, and now you can target those creatures again, and you can equip it for 2 mana, which is not too bad at sorcery speed. Of course, it wouldn't be a mono white deck with Lifegain without a Johnny's Pride Mate. It's a great cat that's a 2/2 for 2 mana, but whenever we gain life, we get a +1/+1 counter on it. And this thing definitely does become large and in charge later in the game. Throw a Shadow Spear on this bad boy. This thing's a 5/5 6/6. Now it has lifelink and trample. This thing's now hitting your opponent and gaining life to actually pump it back up. Then we get the Griffin Airy, which is another card from M21, which is very interesting to see in the deck, but it's a cool idea that if we gain 3 or more life this turn, we get a 2/2 white Griffin token with flying, and you can throw a Shadow Spear on one of these Griffins that you create with this, and now you have a Griffin that's producing more Griffins every turn that you attack. The only thing is, it only happens on your turn, so if you even gain life on your opponent's turn, 3 or more life on your opponent's turn, you're not going to get the Griffin out of this. It's only at the end of your end step. So that's the one thing just to throw out there. Don't try to set up something to gain 3 life on your opponent's turn to then get a Griffin. That doesn't actually work. Then a Banishing Light for that 1 spot removal, if there's one pesky card that's in your way, whether it's a Questing Beast or something with Death Touch or something Planeswalker wise, or just something you think your opponent's going to utilize for maybe their end of what they're trying to do on the battlefield. Banishing Light's always a solid 3 cost exile target card from the graveyard, or exile target card from the battlefield until this leaves the battlefield. So definitely a good solid card there. Then we get the Basri Ket. Yet again, a very solid Planeswalker for 3 mana. It gives target creature puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature. The target creature now gains indestructible, which is definitely very good. You give it something that has lifelink, you now get that additional +1/+1 life every turn, and every time you put that counter on, it goes up and up. You can -2 whenever 1 or more non-token creatures attack. You get that many 1/1 white soldier tokens tapped and attacking, so you get to make your attack even more aggressive. Or you can -6 if we get to that point. You get an emblem with at the beginning of your combat of your turn, create a 1/1 white soldier token and put a +1/+1 counter each creature you control. So just an overall, just make your creature board stronger, which is possible to do if we create a big enough board that protects bossery, but it's not something we're really trying to strive for. I think the +1/+1 and indestructible is actually a very solid ability to keep things around, preventing your opponent, maybe if they have something with death touch or something that if they block they can kill something. So definitely a good card there. And then of course, yet again, another card that wouldn't be a mono white deck without Helios the Sun Crown. It's a 3 mana card, legendary enchantment, indestructible. It has, if our devotional weight is less than 5, which is, with this deck, as you can see here, there's a lot of things that cost cheap mana, but if we start playing a bunch of them on the battlefield, this thing will definitely get to 5 very quickly. But the thing that's good about this card is whenever we gain life, we get a +1/+1 counter on target creature, our enchantment we control, so you can even put it on this. And then we can also tap 2 mana and we can give another target creature lifelink. So another way to give things additional life, gain you a whole bunch of life. Just interesting ways to help you gain life and, you know, triggering this to put more +1/+1 counters. Then we got Linden as well, the Steadfast Queen. You play this on turn 3 after playing like a Pride Mate and maybe, you know, Healer's Hawk. Now every time you attack in with something, you get 1 life, you gain 1 life. So triggering the Johnny on attack swing, so if that Johnny taps for attack, now that Johnny's gained 1 life for itself, the 1 life for the Healer sucks, and it's now swinging in instead of the 2/2, now it's swinging in for a 4/4, possibly a 5/5 if you attack the previous turn with a Healer Sock when it had Summon Sickness. But this is just something that's going to help you benefit, gain chunks of life at a time, you know, putting your pressure on your opponent very, very quickly. And this itself, when it attacks, actually is vigilant, so it doesn't tap, so this actually can still stay as back as a blocker, but overall a very good ability there. They got the Resplendent Angel from M19. It's flying at the beginning of our end step. If we gain 5 more life return, create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying and vigilance. So we're creating 4/4 angel tokens from this. We can actually tap 6 mana, and then we can, until end of turn, Resplendent Angel gets +2/+2 on lifelink. So in the end game, it kind of like, you know, we can kind of use this to get, you know, additional lifelink. But the idea here, if we gain 5 or more life return, now we're creating angels on top of possible griffins. Definitely a cool way to just, you know, create this wide board presence that your opponent just has to deal with. Then you got Loris of the Dream Den, another cool way to kind of like get things back from the graveyard that may have died that are cost 2 or less. So if we get back Primates, get back, you know, Speakers, Soul Wardens, Serra Ascendants, Legion Landing, so on and so forth. If anything that's 1 or less gets killed, we can always get it back and then replay it once a turn. Then on top of that, we got a Johnny's Strength of Pride, which is like the most expensive card in the deck, which is 4 mana, which this deck doesn't require too much mana in that sense. But for 4 mana, we can +1, we gain life equal to the number of creatures we control, plus number of planeswalkers we control. So, you know, plus a Johnny, you know, which is our only planeswalker we play, we can gain, you know, X amount of life. We can -2 create our own, we can create new copies of a you know, Johnny's Pride Mate, pretty much. So we can make this thing create a Johnny's Pride Mates, and if we have 15 more life total than our starting life total, a Johnny's Primate we exile Johnny Primate, and we also exile all artifacts and creatures your opponents control. So we pretty much wipe out their whole, you know, physical board presence of their creatures, swing in really big, possibly win the game. You know, it's kind of a good finisher if we're at that point. And the mana base, like I said, is pretty simple. It's 2 Castle Ardenvales to help us pump up more creatures in the late game if we start running a little light on creatures, or if our opponent board wipes or something, we can also just create more tokens that way. 16 Plains, and then 4 Radiant Fountain, which is a new card from M21 that we gain 2 life when it comes to the battlefield. So just another additional way to trigger or gain life. So overall, this deck is pretty fun. Yet again, it's a little bit more on the expensive side in the sense that you may have to be invested into Historic a little bit for some of the rares. But overall, you can build like a standard version of mono white along these lines and get somewhere close to this and kind of work your way up to this. So overall, it's not an expensive deck, but it is a very fun deck yet again. But if our opponent's playing that mono red deck and you play against this, unfortunately, this deck then becomes null and void and you're not gaining the life, and then this deck doesn't work the way it does. But overall, it's a fun deck to play, and it's the 3rd most played deck currently in the Historic meta. All right, so the next deck up on the list is a deck that there was a version of this kind of in Standard floating around, but this one's a little bit different. With Jumpstart coming, we got introduced to a card called Core Spirit Dancer. It was a card that existed before, but Jumpstart brought it back into like this MTG arena. And what it does is a card that gets +2/+2 for every, I should just put my hand on it. It gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it, and then whenever we cast an aura spell, we get to draw a card. This card is very strong. If we get, you know, good enchantments early, we can definitely ramp up into a whole bunch of card advantage stuff, and then pretty much, you know, this thing becomes too big and your opponent really just has to deal with it in general. And this deck plays a couple things to kind of protect this from possibly dying overall. So first off, we play the Lures of the Dream Den. We can always get it back as long as the core Spirit Dancer wasn't exiled. We can replay anything that costs 2 or less, which, because we play this as our companion, everything in our deck is 2 or less, so all this stuff can be replayed from our graveyard once a turn. So that's definitely good in that sense. But what this deck is trying to do is trying to ramp up, put a lot of things on, put a lot of enchantments on either core Spirit Dancer, or the other card in the deck, if you haven't seen, is the 0 mana Ornithopter, which is a 0/2 flyer right off the bat. Costs 0 mana, so it doesn't cost us anything to play it. And then we can put enchantments on things in the air, and our opponent now has to figure out how to either block it and or deal with it. So we play 3 copies of Ornithopter, then we play All-Seas Life Bounty, which is another card here that we can reoccur with if we have Lurrus on the deck, and this thing can throw itself in front of whatever our opponent's trying to do and give target creature or enchantment we control protection of a color of our choice until end of turn. The only thing that's going to stink if our opponent is playing a white and they try to target one of our things, if we sacrifice this and we target white, we lose any enchantments on that creature that we target with this. If we give it protection from white, we lose all those auras. So that's the only downfall of playing, of us playing against a white deck. So that's one thing to look out for. But as well, we also play Keymerch's Blessing, which is another card that gets +2/+2 end of turn if enchanted creature is an enchantment creature. If it's an enchanted creature or an enchantment creature, which means that like All-Seas Bounty is an enchantment creature or the creature's enchanted, it also gains hexproof, indestructible, so it's another way to protect our enchanted creatures or enchantment creatures from being targeted by a spell or ability. So this is something also this is also very good additional +2/+2 damage. Then we got Selfish Savior, which is another thing that can throw itself in front of a creature, give it indestructible and a turn, and itself is a 1/1 for 1 mana. So that's definitely good. And these are cards that we can always reoccur with Lurrus on the battlefield. So we can sacrifice it on a turn, or if opponent tries to kill it again, we can also bring it back and then sacrifice it again, so on and so forth, and rinse and repeat. Then we got Sentinel's Eyes, which gives our target creature +1/+1 in Vigilance. So you can give something like a core Spirit Dancer or Ornithopter, or even Selfish Savior or All-Seeds +1/+1 in Vigilance. And now they don't tap when they attack, so that's definitely good. And we can also escape it for 1 mana, and we can remove 2 cards from our graveyard and bring it back. Then we got Arcane Flight, which is 1 mana. Enchanted creatures +1/+1 and has flying, so definitely a cheap enchantment for 1 mana. Gives target creature now flying, so we can give our core Spirit Dancer flying, which then triggers that, draw more cards, it's cheap, and so on and so forth. You kind of see the process that we're playing a lot of cheap auras and attachments onto like a core Spirit Dancer just to kind of, just deal X amount of damage. Then we got the Curious Obsession, which makes a enchanted creature +1/+1, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, we may draw a card. And at the end of our end step, if we didn't attack with a creature this turn, we sacrifice this. So typically you're just attacking with the creature you're enchanting. If it has Vigilance, we don't have to tap it, but we're drawing a card every single time that creature does damage to our opponent. So that's definitely very good. All Deck Glitters gives +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment we control. This deck has a majority enchantments, so we're gonna get this creature's gonna get very big very, very quickly. Then we got the Hushbringer, which is very interesting here. It actually turns off like the Goblin decks, so like when they come into battlefield, they trigger these abilities. This actually turns those off. It's a 2 mana 1/2 flyer, has lifelink. Creatures enter the battlefield or die and don't cause their abilities to trigger. So it turns on that, and it turns on the sacrifice style decks. So that, except for the Priest of the Forgotten Gods, because that's an activated ability. But making our opponent not have these abilities that when creature dies trigger, or when they enter the battlefield trigger, is definitely a way to keep this deck in a good way. And this actually I think is why it's very competitive against like a Goblin style deck, because it keeps those Goblin entered abilities in check, so they don't actually trigger, allowing them to do the Goblin things and play their big Goblins and stuff. Then we got the core Spirit Dancer, which like I said is the bread and butter of this deck. It's +2/+2 for each aura attached to it, and whenever we cast an aura spell, we get to draw a card. So essentially it's like the white mana version of the Citizen Champion, but I think overall this is actually, I think, better, just because you get +2/+2, and whenever you cast an aura, I guess it's not an enchantment, but you cast an aura. This deck is mostly auras. It's one of those things that I think this is slightly better, just because this deck is focused on casting auras, where the other one is just focused on casting auras and enchantments. So let me know what you guys think down in the comments below, which one you think is better, but definitely a good card. Then we have the Aether Tunnel, which is actually a very interesting card here. Enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and can't be blocked. So now you put this on like a core Spirit Dancer, this thing could be like a 9/9 or something even crazier, and now that creature can't be blocked at all. And your opponent has to figure out how to deal with that by either spot removing or just doing something like that. So definitely a cool, interesting card there to give something unblockable, essentially. Then we got then after that we got Staggering Insight, which enchanted creature is +1/+1 and has lifelink, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. So just another way to get now lifelink. So now our big creature now is gaining us big chunks of life at a turn, and now if that creature does damage to a player, now we get to draw cards. So essentially now we're just gaining a life, drawing cards, making our creatures bigger, hitting our opponent in the face as hard as possible. And overall, the mana base is pretty straightforward. It's 9 plains, 3 islands, 4 glacial fortress, 4 hollow fountains, and 1 temple of enlightenment. So overall, this deck is on the budget side. I think the only thing that's rare here is the Hushbringers and the mana base, but I think you can get away with probably playing more of the the common mana. It just may be that you may be a little slower, or you may just go all in and maybe just play just basics and maybe just like ways to search them up if that's the way you want to play. But playing dual lands are just essentially a little bit better, just on the sense that now you have mana that can do one or other. But other than that, it's core Spiritbringers and the Hushbringers. So this is definitely a very interesting deck that you can play if you just want to get like an entry level into Historic. And it's like the second most played deck, so it's definitely something you'll definitely run into. So if you want to build around playing a deck like this is something to look out for on the Historic best of one side. All right, and then the next deck up here is Goblins. I mean, I don't know what else to say about this Goblin deck. Is that it's good, it's very dirty, and to some people this deck is super duper broken. But if you build around it, I think there's ways to prevent it. But what this deck does is pretty straightforward. The goal here is to play a bunch of goblins on the battlefield, get hopefully to Muxus, and then have Muxus do its Muxus things and just hit him for big damage. So if you don't really know how to do it, it plays a card called Skirt Prospector. And the idea of this card is that you can sacrifice a goblin, play red mana, get red mana. So the goal here is you kind of play your turns. Hopefully you're playing on curve. You play a Skirt Prospector into maybe a Snoop or a Goblin Instigator, creating goblins on the battlefield. And then you can cycle, deal damage. Goblin Chieftain, which gives other goblins +1 in haste, so it makes the goblins that come out from Muxus instant, like allow them to attack immediately. Then it plays things to help search for goblins, like Goblin Matron, a Goblin Warchief, which makes our goblins cost 1 less to cast, and then gives all our goblins haste. So either one of the Goblin Chieftain or Warchief are the 2 cards you want to look out for. So because they provide haste to your creatures, so it allows those creatures to come in immediately. You got Krenko, which with haste, and you have X amount of goblins on the battlefield. Now it creates X 1/1 red goblin tokens equal to the number of goblins you control. So just an additional way to gain more goblins. And you got Muxus, like I said, when he enters the battlefield, we reveal top 6 cards of our library, put all the goblin creature cards with mana cost 5 or less among them onto the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. And Muxus attacks gets +1/+1 for each other goblin you control. Now, like, he doesn't have trample, but if you have a very wide board, your opponent just can't deal with it because you're just swinging in with everything. Like if you have this plus like a Goblin Chieftain, all our goblins are just that much stronger, and your opponent probably doesn't have a board that's that wide to deal with it. It also plays Castle Embereth, 2 copies, and 20 mountains. So overall, this deck is pretty straightforward. And the one thing I find cool, it's a cool tribal deck that's very, very good. Like I said, when you have the right cards, you can just go off in before your opponent can even blink. That's the reason why this deck, essentially, to a lot of people, is very broken and just annoys them a lot. Just in the sense that you can just see it all play out, and even if you try to have the best hand against it, it's sometimes just too late, especially on the play. If this deck is on the play, it's just going to hit you so hard that you just can't even deal with, and then you might as well scoop by turn 3 if you haven't dealt with what is on the board. So with that being said, guys, this is pretty much the Historic meta deck, and I did promise you one other bonus deck that I think is a very good entry point if you want to get into Historic and don't really want to spend a lot of wild rare cards. I think this deck actually only requires, I think, 4 of them, if I'm not mistaken. But let's dive into that deck and kind of break that one down. All right, so the last and final deck up is actually Mono Blue Tempo. If you don't know what Mono Blue Tempo is, I actually did a standard version of the deck. I don't know if I'll link that here, but that's like the style of the deck. So the goal here is you're kind of just playing reactive Magic, in the sense that you play things in response to what your opponent plays. Whether you're playing like cards to counter your opponent's things, you're playing spells that have flash at the end of your opponent's turns, just various cards here to react to how your opponent's playing, which is actually very annoying Magic. It's like, essentially this is kind of like a flash deck, though there's some cards that are creatures that don't have flash, but essentially you're reacting to your opponent. And the reason why it's tempo is there's a lot of ways for us to keep things in our hand to kind of like keep on curve. Like just, we play a few things and we have ways to draw more cards to fill our hand back up without really playing more things. So what this deck does is plays cards like Curious Obsession, which gives target creature +1/+1, and whenever you deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. So just a way to, every time a creature deals damage, we're drawing cards. So that's one way. We got Ops to scry the top card of our library, then draw a card, so we kind of set up maybe the next perfect card that we need to draw. We got Siren Stormtamer, which is a 1 mana 1/1 flyer. That if we tap 1 blue mana, you sacrifice it. Counter target spell or ability that targets a creature or us. So we can counter target spell for 1, pretty much essentially that's going to target us or a creature. Spectral Sailor, which is a very solid 1 mana 1/1 flash flyer. Late game, you can tap the 4 mana and now draw a card. Spell Pierce, which is not in standard, but it's a very solid counter target non-creature spell unless it's control pace 2. In the early game, this is very strong, especially in decks that try to play ramp cards and things like that you can counter. Brineborn Cutthroat is a card that takes advantage of us now playing reactive magic. We play it at the end of our opponent's turn. The following turn, we can then, pump this guy up. It then starts to become a bigger creature that our opponent then has to deal with. Then we got Lofty Denial. If we have anything that's a flyer, this is a 2 mana counter target spell unless our control pays 1. Or if we have a flyer or something with flying on the battlefield, they have to pay 4 instead for 2 mana. So definitely a very solid spell in that sense. That it's essentially a 2 mana counter if unless our opponent pays 4. So definitely good in that. Then we get the Merfolk Trickster, which is another card with flash, and when it enters the battlefield, we have to tap target creature opponent controls, and that creature loses all abilities in a turn. So anything like, let's just say, we go and our opponent plays a deck with Priest of Forgotten Gods, we can actually, I would say before their draw step. So you probably want to do upkeep stop. You can flash this in, and we can tap down the Priest of the Forgotten Gods, and then we can actually make it lose all its abilities and tap it, so they can't actually use it. So definitely a cool thing like that. There's other things you could probably do there too, where you can kind of react to knowing what your opponent may be doing by tapping it down before they can actually activate an ability. This is only if you have priority though. So your opponent, if we let your opponent go to the main phase, this can't tap down, a Priest of Forgotten Gods in response. Thing is though, if they tap it down in their upkeep, then they have to play all that stuff during the upkeep, which then eliminates them from playing creatures, and they kind of lose their mana. So there's different ways you can do with that. And the Brazen Borrower, of course, because it's a 3 mana 3/1 with flash and flying, but the Petty Theft ability is a good way to bounce your opponent's creatures, so it's like a 2-for-1 card, which makes it very strong. Then we have the Lookout Dispersal, which is a 3 mana counter target spell. The spell costs 1 less if you control Pirate. Counter target spell is its controller pays 4. So it's a 3 mana counter essentially. If we have the Brineborn Cutthroat, which I think is the only Pirate we play, it essentially costs 2 mana. So it's just another card that kind of gets better if we have more like a pirate on the battlefield. But essentially it's a 3 mana counter unless our controller pays 4, which is something that could happen, but definitely a good card in that sense. Then we have the Sea Dasher Octopus, which is another interesting card here. It's a flash. You can mutate it for 2 mana, and whenever this creature deals damage to a player, draw a card. So you can essentially flash this onto one of our flying creatures if they don't block, and then we get to draw a card in that sense. So definitely a good card in that area. And you can do it at instant speed, so definitely good in response to something. Wizard's Retort, it's a 3 mana counter target spell, costs 1 less if we control a wizard, and counter target spell essentially. And then it's 20 islands. So overall this deck is straightforward in what it's trying to do. It's, like I said, I think the only rare in here is 3 copies of the Sea Dasher Octopus, and everything else is, well, and 4 Brazen Borrowers. Okay, so it's not essentially the most budget friendly deck, but if you play standard, you may already have some of these cards, you may have already collected some of these cards. So overall it's probably the cheapest standard deck that I went over in today's video. But essentially it's a very fun deck. It does frustrate your opponent, and if you ever get stuck against it, it can be very frustrating. But guys, with that being said, this is the list of the historic meta decks that on Aetherhub that they have. The list here can fluctuate in order. You may see decks come up. I gave it a week out from when Amonkhet came out, so this list could still be changing as the meta still evolves from seeing what really came out of Amonkhet. But let me know what you guys think, which one maybe you may be playing already in historic meta, or which one you plan on playing possibly in historic meta, down in the comments below. But if you like this video, hit that like button. If you want to post more videos, hit that subscribe button. I'll catch you in the next video.